Hello, I'm Patrick, and I've just begun reading Father Servais Pinckaers' book, The Sources of Christian Ethics. He's a Dominican priest, um, and this book is substantial and edifying, full of great stuff, great information. So I thought I would start this series of videos sort of summarizing and offering my reflections on each chapter as we go along. So today I'm just gonna try to summarize and talk about my thoughts through the introduction and the first chapter of the book. Once again, Servais Pinckaers, The Sources of Christian Ethics. Here we go. So in the introduction, he kind of comes out right out the gate with some comments on Vatican II. He says that Vatican II, properly interpreted, functions to reincorporate patristics and scripture into the field of moral theology, but in a non-exclusive and holistic way. That's my paraphrase. Many interpreters of Vatican II seek to revert to patristics and or scripture at the expense of systematic, perhaps Thomistic moral theology, which is, according to Pinckaers, a dangerous move. It's important to remember, of course, that Pinckaers himself is a Dominican and himself an admirer of Thomas and of his theology. And of his system. He goes on to say, Pinckaers, that Christian moral teaching is far more than a catalog of precepts concerning behavior, classified and more or less determined by particular situations. This is the mistake, he claims, of the last 2 or 3 or 4 centuries in moral theology, that it is too law and commandment focused, and that it becomes essentially this, that you get these moral handbooks that have just a list of do's and don'ts, mostly don'ts, based on particular situations or circumstances. And he thinks that moral theology is a much greater field of study and a greater field of consideration than that narrow definition. However, it does need to be systematic, he says. It needs to be systematic with basic criteria for judgment. So it's important for him. I think what we'll see here is how Pinckaers is trying to be a synthesis of old and new ways. And perhaps that's even the wrong language. He maybe he's more of a return to an older way, and may be seen as trying to be a synthesis between systematic and patristic and scriptural theology, to be a synthesis between stuff. My final reflection on the introduction, he says Christian ethics need to be genuinely and thoroughly scriptural. So it's important for him that these considerations are scriptural, that they are read in the light of Scripture, and that they come primarily, their source is primarily from the Scriptures. Okay, moving on to chapter 1. He begins chapter 1 with concern for just defining moral theology. He says there are a wide variety of definitions on offer, but that there are a few kind of core principles that everyone grants, and that those principles are, according to him, Christian ethics is a branch of theology that studies human acts in the light of revelation. So there's kind of 3 main things. It's a branch of theology, it studies human acts, and it does so in the light of revelation. Those 3 things are core to all definitions that he will then go on to give. Which he then does. The first definition he gives states Christian ethics as adherence to the imperatives of the moral law and their corresponding obligations. The moral law and their corresponding obligations. He's going to talk a lot about obligations this chapter and in chapter 2 as well. This is too juridical for Pinckaers, a little too extrinsic to what it means to be a person, to be a human. He views law and obligation as things that are extrinsic, that are outside, that are kind of placed upon a person, that they are not internal. Therefore, they are less natural to man, right? He's going to kind of offer some criticisms of Kant in a bit, and that's in his second definition, which he offers. That's sort of what he does. In the second definition, he moves towards. He states that a second definition moves towards compliance with duty rather than obligations, which is something more basic and internal. So we're moving towards the internal life of a person. The second definition also begins to substitute law for norms, right? So rather than adhering to law, it's adherence to norms, the norms of religious faith, to moral theology, norms, and in compliance with duty rather than with obligations. So somebody's duty is a little bit more internal than their obligations. Effectively, it winds up being something very similar. He describes this as particularly Kantian, and he compares it to Kant's categorical imperative. He offers a third definition, which is Thomistic, and orients the discussion of moral ethics around pursuing the good and the attainment of happiness. He says this is done by way of virtue ethics. So this is a more positive way of approaching moral theology, I believe, by recognizing the good of human life, and pursuing it, recognizing that good as that which produces happiness in a person, and recognizing that the way by which to attain happiness in the good is through virtues. It's a more positive, less juridical, less negative way of approaching moral theology. He claims that some interpreters of Thomas use this idea of man having an end to basically employ a cosmic obligatory sort of ethics. So he claims that some Thomists have essentially adopted one of the first two definitions offered, and sort of slapped it on this Thomistic model, and essentially not changed too much in the content of the first two definitions. But he claims that Thomas's real concern with moral theology is sort of substantially different from the first two definitions offered. For St. Thomas, in the mainstream tradition of Aristotle and the fathers of the church, the question of happiness is incontestably the first consideration in moral theory. That's from page 6. The question of happiness is incontestably the first consideration in Christian moral theory. So it's really important, the pursuit of happiness. For Aquinas, the questions of duty, precepts, obligations, etc., they arise secondarily, only as they come up out of consideration of the virtues. So, inasmuch as the virtues, the virtue of, let's take any virtue, the virtue of chastity sort of demands that you deny yourself, that you put away lustful thoughts. So inasmuch as virtues demand sacrifice, that is where duty, precepts, obligations, etc., that's where those factor into the equation. So he's not by any means like disposing of those things. He's trying to place them in the proper context. He offers a fourth definition, which examines the question according to the modern value theory of Max Scheler. I don't know anything about Max Scheler or the modern value theory. Perhaps that's something for me, for you to do some research on outside of this time. he does say that the modern value theory of Max Scheler places moral value as one among many values to be evaluated according to and in light of all other values in that same rung of values. I don't really know what that means. So there you go. There's a fourth consideration. There are more definitions as well. He kind of has a section called contemporary definitions. And he says these are particularly reactionary against traditional models, like I think particularly Kantian models. And they prioritize freedom and personal conscience, with special attention to flexibility over and against obedience, obligation, etc. I think a modern moral theology, moral ethics, ethics theories sometimes revolve around a person's autonomy and freedom, at the expense of certainly at the expense of the objective good, the final end of man, and the pursuit of happiness. Finally, Pinckaers offers his own definition. I'm just going to read this. This is from page 8 of the book. He says, Christian ethics is the branch of theology that studies human acts so as to direct them to a loving vision of God, seen as our true complete happiness and our final end. This vision is attained by means of grace, the virtues, and the gifts, in light of revelation and reason. Next, after this, his own definition that he's offered, he's going to break the definition out and say a little bit about each section. So in the section in the first clause of the definition, Christian ethics is a branch of theology. He says that Christian ethics has to be operating as a discipline Christian ethics has been, in the past, operating as a discipline somewhat autonomously and needs to be reunited with other theological disciplines. So he's seen this split between moral theology and, say, biblical or systematic, other branches of theology. He sees them as divorced from each other, and they need to be reunited. One question I had in this section is, what does it mean that Aquinas considers theology a more united science than philosophy? So that's one thing that Pinckaers notes. He says that Aquinas considers theology a more united science than philosophy because philosophy admits duality between its metaphysics and its ethics. So for Aquinas, the metaphysics and ethics of theology are united, and again, that's something I don't really understand. So there's a question that I had. Study of human... Okay, so the second little section part of his definition focuses on that section that says Christian ethics is a branch of theology that studies human acts so as to... Oh, and it goes on. So the study of human acts. And he talks about this. He says there's been too much of a focus on discrete individual acts in the study of ethics at the expense of, like, dispositions, that's my own word, or orientations. So without losing any of the personal realness of individual acts, more effort should be made to incorporate communitarian considerations of ethical decisions and dispositions. So he thinks that there's been too much of a focus on discrete acts and that moral theology should be more focused on dispositions, and he'll go on to talk about intentions as well. He also says, and this is that section, interior acts, which are included in ethics, have been pushed aside by focus on exterior acts, and he thinks that that interior acts should become a focus again. So he thinks that this is also related to intention, right? That you can make interior acts of the will that are moral, that have a very important bearing on your moral state, but that are not sort of externally measurable or viewable. He uses, I think this is my own thought. The way that Jesus says that this woman has given more than all the others because she's given out of her need she's objectively given less than the rich people in the temple, but she has given more because of an interior disposition of being a person who gives, and not just in this discrete act. It's inseparable from the discrete act. Intention is inseparable from discrete acts, but it exists behind them, so to speak. And I think that's what he's trying to get at. The next section, he says, human acts so as to direct them to a loving vision of God. Loving vision of God. So this is the purpose of moral theology, not to accord with laws, but to attain a loving vision of God. He notes several places in Scripture where vision of God is mentioned. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God, is one thing he mentions. That this is the goal of moral ethics. He also says, a return to experience and an ethics which addresses all the parts of a man, not merely his intellect, is necessary. So he wants to incorporate experience. He wants to get a little less abstract and more experience-based. He says, a vision that gives rise to love. Pinckaers sees in the Franciscan tradition a stress on love, and in the Dominican tradition a stress on understanding and on vision. He regrets any rift between these, and uses loving vision accordingly. So he's trying to bring together these kind of disparate traditions which separate love from understanding and vision. So he says loving vision and his definition. The next section in his definition was that it's the study of human acts so as to direct them to a loving vision of God, seen as our true and complete happiness. Happiness is a really important theme, as we'll see in chapter 2. Earlier he had mentioned that for St. Thomas, this is page 6, for St. Thomas, in the mainstream tradition of Aristotle and the Fathers of the Church, the question of happiness is incontestably the first consideration in Christian moral theory. So there's no sense in pursuing an understanding, a pursuit of Christian moral ethics, moral theology, divorced from the question of what makes a man happy. Closing in towards the end, he says, seen as our true complete happiness and our final end. So our final end. By orienting the discussion around the final end of man, Pinckaers includes intention in moral considerations. He says, if man's final end is foremost in his moral considerations, his intention in every moral act as well as his general disposition will be purified. So again, intention is an important thing. And viewing all acts and all dispositions in terms of man's final end is the only real way to orient the discussion, to orient the study in a cohesive, systematic, and meaningful way. Finally, that last clause in the definition. This vision is attained by means of grace, the virtues, and the gifts in the light of revelation and reason. Okay? He says that, revelation and reason in terms of these two things, many Thomistic interpreters, exegetes, exclude, they forget that Thomas quotes the Fathers and Scripture a crazy amount. And they read his theology as a systematic, Aristotelian, logical, rational approach to the questions. And Pinckaers doesn't believe this is an accurate or a fair reading of Aquinas. He thinks that Aquinas, Augustine, and the other fathers are revelation first, kind of. That they use Scripture and revelation in general and reason, but that revelation is the foundation, is the primary starting point for moral considerations, revelation is, and then reason comes in to supplement, to help, to discard false ideas, etc. But that revelation should be the foundation of the study. So that's some thoughts on the introduction in the first chapter of the Sources of Christian Ethics by Servais Pinckaers. There are 14 chapters, so I hope you get something from this, and I'll see you next time. Bye.